you made as a point of reference to talk about, it's when we talk about private sector participation, you could have a lot of private sector participation. You could have private sector investment in an inherently inequitable service model, right? Which means you could, and often this is in treatment, for instance, or and I'm curious, when we think about success KPIs and when we think about service models, where the private sector can come in and actually shift that needle on equity and quality of service. I was curious to hear from you, Ella, or from around the group, if there are some interesting models that have done that well, or what evidence we have of even within the USAID portfolio of how these private sector engagement approaches has helped shift coverage or quality of service in a way that the public sector did not before that. So just wanted to put that out there because I saw quantum of loans raised as a KPI for success, but it'll be interesting to see what evidence we have on equity and quality of service. But that's just something that I wanted to put out there for the group to reflect on. But go ahead, folks. Anyone with comments, suggestions, questions, go ahead. I don't see any hands up yet.
I have.
Oh, great. Go ahead, Tanvi. Hey.
Hi, Ella. Hi, Fan. Hi,
Tanvi.
pals, friends, everybody. It's nice to see everybody. I also had one other question, Ella. I think it's a really cool way of looking at sort of who steps into service vacuums and how can you support the people who are stepping into service vacuums to make that kind of service delivery more accountable, essentially, right? Which is what you just described. Somebody's going to step into a vacuum to provide a basic service. It always happens. I was just kind of thinking back on not just the financial sustainability, but the sort of sustainability of service delivery from an environmental perspective, because I happen to work in a couple of countries where the service vacuum had been filled by private providers, but they were using groundwater at such an absurd rate that it was creating a bigger sort of a sustainability issue down the line. And there were also certain issues with sort of the quality of the water itself. And I was wondering, and I'm not saying that they should then therefore go away, because governments do exactly the same thing. They also use the groundwater and their quality of water is no better often. But essentially in your sort of experience, how has incorporating them or bringing them sort of into the fold of the state in terms of a legitimate service provider helped in improving the quality of the service that they're delivering and the sustainability?
Great, thanks. Yeah, and for those with more experiences to share, please go ahead and interrupt me if I just go on in a soliloquy about this. So yeah, I mean, thanks so much first Deepa for pointing that out. These were slides, a couple of these slides I recycled where you see the mobilized KPI, mobilized funding. Honestly, and this is not published information, but really, we set out in the program I manage for WashFin, which deals a lot with private sector approaches, to mobilize $200 million in the beginning. And then we reduced it to 100 million. We're not close to getting to that. And USAID is not saying the implementing partners have failed, because they haven't. Because the fact of the matter is the sector is not all about value of funding mobilized. It has to be one of the KPIs if we really want to tackle the access and sustainability issues in the sector, but far be it from being the only KPI. So apologies for making it stand out too much. This was, I partly presented some of these to a crowd that was more finance focused, but actually the message that I bring out usually when I show those numbers is really, it's not just those numbers, because it's really hard to get those numbers. And it's quite hard to articulate this. So part of the reason we're actually trying to mobilize private finance is to help segment the market. So there are certain people, and part of your equity piece. So take a Kenya. in a particular city in Kenya, there are certain neighborhoods that can actually, or a certain county, there's certain places that can pay for services and more than double the price of the services. I'm not saying double the price, but whereas there's the peri-urban areas or the more informal areas that mostly cannot. So how do we actually try to segment the market so that we can get more commercial finance to areas that can actually afford it and pay for it? And how can we combine subsidies and grants and maybe some loans or lower interest rate loans to the actual providers that need it? And I'm not saying we're succeeding in doing that in Kenya. It's a long game. It's going through an entire devolution process at the moment. And some of these governance issues are actually affecting service delivery. But back to the equity question for Senegal, that's partly why you saw at the end, again, none of this, and I know I'm being recorded, it's not public information. A lot of this is happening at the moment. So you've got these big providers, but smaller providers that are serving lower income communities in Senegal. So in Dakar and other big, large metropolitan areas, but they can't afford higher interest rates. So how do we then, as development partners, and we're doing this with the Gates Foundation and the government, mobilize additional funding so that they can actually funding and finance, private finance, so that they can serve more people, right? And so, yeah, the KPI is the value funding mobilize that I put in the slides, but it's really also about the equity of the services and making sure that, given that that's one of the big challenges in the sector. And then I think on definitely on the quality of service, I think it's hard. The World Bank itself has a hard time keeping track, most of the development partners, of all of those other KPIs because they're difficult. So that's a commitment we have within USAID, within our Center for Water, is to actually focus more on data collection so that we can actually measure the improvements within the utilities. I see Dennis here. Dennis and his team within EWASH in Nigeria has been doing that. But in some cases, it's been hard to do because honestly, when you talk to a lot of funders, you present this in the Hill or briefings, what do people want to know? How many people have, or mission leadership for us, people want to know how many people have you served? And to get the, and get right to value of the KPI that you mentioned in terms of funding and what's the number of people. But some of the KPIs that we need to think about is the number of hours that you're actually serving water. Did it go from 4 hours to 12, which is what I mentioned in the Mozambique case, because that's a great improvement. And also quality of services. Are you providing better accountability? Are consumers actually having the feedback loop? So we're really trying to prioritize some of these approaches in moving forward in our USAID programs. It's a lot to do. We're a small team within the center and we work globally across the different missions to make sure that these ideas are embedded in our procurement. And lastly, I think Tanvi's question about environmental responsibility always comes up every time we're talking about groundwater, right? So how much more groundwater are you going to extract? And it's something that we think a lot in the case of Maputo. When I said there are 2,000, it's an impressive number, almost 2,000 providers, but it's hard, I think, as US government, as any responsible development entity, we can't say moving that up and expanding services through groundwater is the best option. And that's why I was saying licensing everybody is not the best option either. You got to look at the market. You got to look at where's the need. Are there places where actually they can be taken over by the utility? That's a political question in many ways. And those are some of the things that we can't shy away from, but those are really difficult to do. You need civil society and other players to also push for those kinds of accountability. In Cambodia, this is my last point, we're actually helping provide some pilot water testing kits for these small water providers. And we're hoping that through our work with the Cambodia Water Supply Association, they can also help subsidize through membership fees and others and grants to expand that and be able to really focus on the quality of the water moving forward. So it's definitely at the forefront of our programs. We just don't talk about it that much or at all. Thank you.
Yeah, fascinating. Thanks, Ella. And I know that there are a lot of great people here in this group, and just keep the ideas, feel free to just put, keep feeding in ideas about ways in which you've been more intentional on equity, for instance, or on environmental safety through service model innovation in the urban context. Dennis, Lauren, Barbara, Tanvi, feel free to sort of share ideas in the chat box, and I'll try and summarize that over the course of this conversation. Go ahead. We have Mike from Cadmus. Hi, Mike. You have a question? Give your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi there. And I can be a physical being and not just a black box as well. Nice to connect. Ella, I just wanted to follow up on a couple of questions popped to mind as you were offering your answers to the preceding set of questions. One is, as you were talking about kind of KPIs and the challenge that, I've supported kind of global USAID mechanisms for almost the past decade, and know some of the challenges in buy-in in certain types of performance indicators, and especially performance indicators that are trying to capture the quality of the performance on those indicators versus just kind of numerical achievement, right? Number of people reached. And I'm wondering, how evolved or elaborated have conversations been, whether kind of within missions, have mission leadership, or within your team on kind of trying to refine or develop new types of these KPIs that embed some of these facets of, like, it's not just number of people receiving water service, but it's a improved water delivery or some kind of embedded conceptual element that and that's not necessarily the greatest one, but because I think you have that one already, but yeah, just wondering how kind of evolved those conversations have been in USAID. And then the other question, and a simpler, well, maybe not simpler, but shorter one is, as USAID has continued to kind of work and evolve its work in this space, in the private sector engagement of water service provision, both in urban and rural contexts, how have you seen kind of USAID's relative position to World Bank or MCC, other actors that have been kind of really heavily involved in major investments in urban settings? How have you seen that kind of dynamic change, or are you seeing it change, or kind of curious on your take on that? And I'll stop. Thanks.
Great, thanks. I do hope people also share their experiences, because I feel bad monopolizing this conversation, but I'll try to keep it short. So in performance indicators, we have the state F indicators that we have, but we're also trying our best to have custom indicators. So you will see in the links I provided in terms of our technical briefs that we've provided some examples of custom indicators. It's not enough. So on a regular basis, I have to defend our program to certain mission leadership. That's what I do. Yeah. And I can't give them the numbers because those aren't good enough in the type of work I do, which is governance and mobilizing finance and engaging the private sector. It's sexy to say we got 20 million of funds from Coca-Cola, but what about actually private sector delivering the services, and how that, so in Zambia, these are active conversations, but I'll share a little bit. How part of that is showing some of those potential numbers. These are the people that could potentially benefit, but it's a long trajectory of 5 to 10 years. And unfortunately, we're not going to get there within this time frame of 2, 3, 4, 5 years of when we're implementing. And I have yet to find the silver bullet to do that, but I'm actively in discussions with 2 missions trying to do that. And I think maybe Ellen, I don't know if Ellen Walters in this team, but is in this breakout room, but from IRC, we're partnering with them and other partners to think about the systems approach. But how do you even explain to missions that all of these different pieces have to work and all these needles have to move to actually get to the hundreds of thousands and millions of numbers? And part of it I'm using through graphics. This is where we are now. This is the perception of private sector. And then at the end of 3 years, look, the utilities and local government actually want to engage the private sector. But you have to say a more compelling story than that, because it just sounds like you just wasted $1 million on nothing. And so I must say, we're we're still at it and really trying to demonstrate that, but it's difficult within, you got to have those indicators. I think our team, it's socialized within our center here in DC and with some of our missions, but we've got a long way to go to actually look at those and track it more thoughtfully, so that then I now have to spend time at night actually trying to figure out, how do I draw this to show that this is what happened, even though I don't have millions of people served right now. So yeah, it's work in progress. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Ella. Dennis, go ahead. Yeah, we'd love to hear.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you so much, Ella, for this excellent presentation right from the beginning. Yeah, I just first made a comment that we turn to the private sector basically because of failure by the public sector. That's the traditional approach anyway. But now we realize that it's not only that. I mean, there's a lot that we gain from the private sector in terms of efficiencies, improving in terms of access, because you want, as a private operator, you do not only want to provide the service, but also you want to meet your costs. And so you want to make sure that the cost of production is less, and then maybe you can get more in terms of this. So what is required, therefore, for me, is the issues of regulation, having a strong regulatory framework. I was actually involved in some parts in the Mozambique that Ella talked about, and the interesting thing was that the government and the regulator at first were not keen to regulate the private operators. The private operators, on the other hand, were saying, we would like to be regulated. And what the benefit I saw in that is that if they were under regulation, it means that they are legitimized. Everyone now look at them as legal entities, and therefore they could go to a bank and borrow money because they were providing a legal service. So the issue of regulation to me is very important. Licensing, I certainly do agree with Ella in terms of the numbers. Do you license all the 2,000, 3,000 private providers? You may need to do some more segmentation. And that also speaks to the question which was raised by, I think, and I can't remember, on environmental issues. So like the Mozambique case, the main source for the private water providers is groundwater. And one of the concerns was that as they continue drilling, because Maputo, for example, is a coastal city, so a lot of salty water coming in. Now, there was a question about Nigeria and Zambia. Now, Nigeria, I don't know how many of you know the kind of statistics in terms of water provision, and particularly in the urban areas. Just one small statistic. In 1990, the urban population, only 32% of the urban population had access to piped water. 2015, World Bank did a study, and they found that only 7% of the urban population had the piped water. Of course, if you go to the JMP, the statistics are different. It's all because the standards obviously are slightly different. And so the question is, okay, then how do these guys get water in the urban areas? Basically, the private operators have filled the gap. And the only unfortunate thing at the moment is that the government has not yet seen the reason to to give incentives for the private sector to promote them and so on. So instead, so many efforts are still on how do we incentivize the public entity to make sure that it operates efficiently and effectively. In Zambia, on the other hand, and this is more on the sanitation side, again, kind of failure, but and this is more on the emptying and transportation of fecal slides from septic tanks. I think you realize that in many countries, actually, this is run by the private sector. But in Zambia, they decided to license the private operators. That's the guys who own the trucks. You have 1 truck or 10 trucks, so you get a license, and then there are conditions to be met. If you if you don't go those, you don't meet those license provisions, then you can be penalized for that. But what that has done also is that it has encouraged or motivated even banks to consider giving some loans. I mean, I don't have figures to say how many of them have borrowed money from the banks. But what it means is that it improves the quality of the service, and then everything definitely gets much better. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Dennis. I think that sparked so many new questions. And I know, Maya, go ahead. You've had your hand raised for a while now. Please go ahead.
Yes, I think this topic has come up a little bit in some of the discussion since I raised my hand as well. But one of the areas that I'd be interested in hearing from Ella and also possibly others who are involved in implementation about is the capacity of different government entities to sort of oversee and manage contracts with the private sector. I just wrapped up a study on sanitation services in 3 South Asian countries, specifically looking at the municipal level. And one of the big challenges really was to monitor the private service providers that they contracted and make sure that they were living up to the standards that the municipal government had set. And so anyone who has thoughts on that, I'd be really interested to hear from.
I can quickly comment on that. That is one of the biggest problem, enforcement capacities. So again, going back to Nigeria, a lot of states have actually developed new laws. When you look at them, they are great laws, which are commercializing, engaging with the private sector and so on. But the issue of enforcement is something which is a problem. So for me, if there's any way that development partners can provide support, is to how either to have an independent team that does the enforcement of the contracts. So look at Senegal. Now this is the big thing actually. As you might know, Senegal has I think they just changed the company now. It's Veolia, which is managing a private company managing water in the whole of urban cities in Senegal. Now, contract management, instead of being managed by the government, there is an entity which was established, which is known as SONES, and that's the one which manages the contracts. And it's the same in different countries where you have this. If you go to Gabon and Niger, again, where they have all these big private companies, but even the local small private operators, because as a businessman, you tend to have to know more, and you know what you want to do, and you can and the government sectors unfortunately may not have as much qualified people. So we need to build capacity of the government, or at least some entity to manage the contracts and the enforcement.
Interesting. And I know there's a parallel conversation between Mike and Ellen on sort of particularly what Ellen, while it's, Ellen, if you think there are comments just in response to this question, before we jump on and talk about some of the things that Ellen, you've talked about and Mike's raised questions on, because this is an important area. And Ella, you talked about the importance of regulation, and you lead with sort of strengthening public sector capacities and creating mandate first to regulate, and then strengthening capacities to do that well. And that having and doing it in a way where you're not crowding out private sector investments and participation, but at the same time is able to allows for us to be more intentional on equity and service quality and environmental safety. And this is complex. And I can see why that those KPIs are not the most obvious KPIs on top, because those things take time to achieve. And when you go back to your, whoever is financing this, it's much more difficult KPIs to show progress on. But I do think constantly being intentional about those primary goals at city scale. How many poor people have we reached? Have we changed the quality of service? And is it more affordable now? And if we don't have good answers to those questions, and if we can't lead with those questions and answers to those questions at the city scale, I feel like we constantly just keep talking about PPP contracts for fecal sludge treatment plants, which really doesn't have any real impact on service quality or coverage or affordability. But Ellen, any comments on just practical suggestions, or anybody else on how can we deal with sort of the weak enforcement, or is that even a good place for DFIs to be putting more money in terms of TA and capacity building? Feel free, Ellen, and then please go ahead and talk. I mean, we'd love to hear from you on some of the other awesome stuff you've mentioned in the chat box.
All right, thanks so much. So we have seen, so I just mentioned in the chat around the master planning process, which happens at local level, but what I was in the middle of kind of trying to add to that I'll just say is the influencing at national level. So around, I guess, advocacy and influencing is where we've seen most success. The citizen engagement and accountability, for example, plays a key role in regulation. So there's the political and the high level like enforcement that happens related to that, but then there's also other aspects that we've seen through our watershed program, a lot at county level in Kenya, and where the regulation and the regulators are being held accountable in other ways if the government isn't playing that role. And so there's this kind of mix between the multiple different types of stakeholders being involved in that process. And we've found a lot of, we've seen quite a bit of changes in a couple of the watershed countries, also in places like Bangladesh and in India, at more of a localized level, so not necessarily in large urban scale, but when kind of linking the policy regulation, linking all of the pieces together, and that accountability. So that's one aspect. And I was mentioning in the chat, and I'm happy to maybe, as opposed to trying to pull all the links while we're having our discussion, I can share with you a couple of links about kind of master planning processes and collective action and bringing people together. We've got some really good examples on that in Ghana, Uganda, Ethiopia, Burkina Faso, and a couple of other places. And some of the partners that we work with, we've seen similar things, and it's all called different things in different places, but that collective effort of getting, government-led, but getting everyone together in the room, including private sector, including, all of the different stakeholders at the table to have something very concrete come out of that. And there's a lot of different forms that takes. Yeah, so happy to share more about that. And I don't want to monopolize. I know we only have a couple of minutes left, so I'll just leave it there, and I'm happy to follow up with anybody I can, who has questions on that. I can put my email in the chat and people can follow up if they want, but I'll share some resources with you, Deepa.
Thank you. Moines and Amrita, please go ahead. I forget who, Moines, go ahead, Moines.
Yes, thank you, Deepa. So this should be quick because I know we're running out of time, but I have a couple of questions. I've worked in the water sector on the USAID side and as a contractor, and the private sector can be good resource and also service providers. And we always spend money, actually billions of dollars, on building the capacity of the government organization or public institutions. But is USAID interested in spending more or investing more on building the capacity of the local service providers? Now, this is a private sector, a local private sector that would ensure sustainability if they are really in good position to continue providing services. We've done so under one of our projects, but not in the water sector, where we were able to help the private sector in their technical and managerial and organizational capacity, build their capacity so that they continue providing services after the project ends. So now, can we apply that on the water sector, or what does USAID have in mind for the future? Thank you.
If you don't mind, what I'll do is just quickly, Amrita, maybe if you, is it a comment or a question? I'll take that in as well, because we'd love to, yeah, please go ahead, and Ella, we'll try and see if we can respond to that question quickly in under 45 seconds. Go ahead, Amrita, sorry about the pressure.
No, not at all. And I think this was more of just like an open discussion, but to talk about maybe to follow up on the capacity of the private sector and the importance of associations within cities or within countries. So many of them, as we've just talked about are, one person with a broken down truck or some poor infrastructure, and finding loans is so difficult. So it'd be interesting just to hear about more perspectives of people who have worked either supporting associations and the pros and cons of that, or peer-to-peer partnership such as WAPs or other agencies. So might save that for another conversation. But
Ella, maybe take up the public sector capacity building one first. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, so no, let me see if I captured it all. I think in terms of the appetite for USAID to support capacity building, I mean, we support both infrastructure and also capacity building, and we've really been shifting towards more capacity building, especially where it's needed. I mean, Dennis can attest to that in our work in Nigeria. It's really more about supporting some equipment and supplies, and most of it is on institutional capacity building. But we also have to balance that out with government requests for, we get it, we need capacity, but we also want some infrastructure in place. So really kind of balancing that out and also getting them to understand that, well, for that infrastructure to actually last, we need to make sure that it's managed properly and you have all of the right systems in place. So it's a dialogue, but it's definitely something that we're committed to in our strategy. And then there's a question on our work versus vis-a-vis MCC and the World Bank. We're definitely shifting towards more urban focus in certain missions. It's a slow process because traditionally a lot of our work beyond the Middle East and India and parts of Southeast Asia has really been focused on rural. So you'll see a shift towards more urban, even in the African countries where we work. And that's something that we're seeing. And associations supporting, we're doing that in Cambodia, definitely a double-edged sword, because what if the association is not seen as representing the providers that they're supposed to represent? I'm not saying that's the case for Cambodia, but it's always something to think about. But we're trying to do that because that's really one way to institutionalize the type of capacity building that we need.
That was fantastic. And we have 8 seconds. That's amazing. Thank you so much, Ella. And Amrita, there's also some interesting examples in Kampala. And I guess we'll be